February 26, 1957. The winter air in Philadelphia was sharp and cold when a young college student named Frank decided to check his muskrat traps in a wooded area of Fox Chase, a quiet neighborhood in the northeast part of the city. It was a normal afternoon, an ordinary pastime in a simpler era of suburban America. But what Frank saw that day would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he walked through the densely wooded area along Susquehanna Road, something caught his attention. About 15 feet from the path, partially hidden in the underbrush, was an old cardboard box. A JCPenney box that had once contained a bassinet crib. It wasn't unusual to find trash dumped in remote areas, so Frank almost didn't pay attention to it. Almost. Something about the box made him stop. The way it was positioned, the feeling in the air. He approached, looked inside, and his world stopped. Inside the box was the body of a small child. Frank froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The child was naked, wrapped in a cheap blanket, his body folded to fit in the confined space of the box. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Frank ran. He ran home, his heart pounding, his mind spinning. But when he got home, he didn't call the police. Instead, he remained silent. Years later, he would explain that he didn't want to get involved, that he feared becoming a suspect, that he simply panicked. Several days would pass before another soul discovered the child. And when they did, it would begin one of the most heartbreaking and enduring missing persons cases in American history. A child with no name, no home, no one to claim him. The boy in the box. America's unknown child. A mystery that remains unsolved more than 65 years later. Before we delve deeper into this heartbreaking story, I need to pause and connect with you. Where are you listening tonight? Are you lying in your bed in Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Madrid, or perhaps somewhere in the United States? Let me know in the comments. I love knowing that we're all here together, in the quiet of the night, honoring the memory of those who cannot speak for themselves. If this is your first time here, welcome to a space where we treat true crime with the seriousness and respect it deserves. We're not here for the morbid or the sensational. We're here to tell stories that matter, to remember victims as people, not just as cases. If that resonates with you, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And if you're already part of this community, thank you. Your support, a simple a comment, sharing this video with someone who understands the importance of these stories, means more than you can imagine. Now, let's return to Philadelphia, February 1957, and to the second discovery of the boy in the box. The college student John, who had found the child first, had said nothing, but fate had other plans. Days later, a young salesman named LaSalle was driving down Susquehanna Road, looking for houses where he could make door-to-door sales. He stopped to urinate on the side of the road, and as he ventured into the wooded area, he saw it. The box. Unlike Frank, LaSalle didn't flee. He looked inside, confirmed the horror of what he was seeing, and ran directly to the nearest house. "There's a dead child in the woods," he told the residents, his voice trembling. "You need to call the police. Now." The call came to the Philadelphia police at 4:30 p.m. By the time officers arrived at the scene, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. What they found chilled them to the bone. Detective Sam Weinstein was one of the first to arrive. He was a veteran of the force, a man who had seen his share of death and tragedy. But this was different. This was a child. The JCPenney box lay on its side in the underbrush. The child inside had been placed carefully, almost tenderly, wrapped in a checkered blanket. But there was something deeply disturbing about the scene beyond the obvious tragedy of a child's death. The child was completely naked beneath the blanket. His hair had been crudely trimmed, with irregular locks suggesting that someone had recently tried to change his appearance. His fingernails and toenails had been cut, almost aggressively short, as if someone had been trying to clean evidence. There was no identification.
No clothing. No shoes.
Nothing that could tell them who this child was or where he came from. The coroner estimated that the child was between 4 and 6 years old. He measured approximately 3 feet 3 inches tall and weighed around 30 pounds. Small for his age, possibly malnourished. He had light brown hair and blue eyes. He would have been a beautiful child in life, with delicate features and a facial structure that spoke of youthful vulnerability. But what most disturbed the investigators were the marks on his body. The child had scars, old scars that suggested long-term abuse or neglect. His ankles showed marks that could have been from restraints. There were bruises in various stages of healing, indicating repeated trauma over time. This child had suffered, not just at the end, but for a long, long time. The cause of death was determined to be blows to the head, but the exact time of death was impossible to pinpoint. The body had been exposed to the elements for days, possibly weeks. The cold February weather had preserved the body somewhat, but had also complicated forensic analysis. Detectives combed the area looking for any evidence. The box itself was examined meticulously. It was a standard JCPenney cardboard box that had contained a bassinet crib. These boxes were common. They could be purchased at any JCPenney store in the country. There were no unique markings, no serial numbers, nothing that could be traced. The blanket was sent for analysis. It was cheap, the kind sold at discount stores. Again, impossible to trace. But there was one clue. Next to the box, investigators found a man's cap, an Ivy driver's cap. It wasn't clear whether it belonged to the killer or was simply unrelated trash that had been dumped in the same area. And there, in that cold woods in Fox Chase, began one of the most extensive homicide investigations in Philadelphia history. An investigation that would eventually involve hundreds of detectives, generate tens of thousands of leads, and consume countless hours of police work. All for a child that no one seemed to know. A child that no one claimed. A nameless child. The child's body was taken to the coroner's office where Dr. Joseph Spellman performed an exhaustive autopsy. What he discovered painted a disturbing picture of the child's final days and possibly years of life. The immediate cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The child had been struck with enough force to fracture his skull. But Dr. Spellman found something else. Evidence that the child had been bathed recently, probably shortly before or shortly after his death. There were soap residues in his hair. His nails, though cut aggressively short, were clean. Someone had taken the time to wash this body, to clean any evidence that could lead back to them. The child's hair showed signs of having been cut crudely, possibly with kitchen scissors instead of proper barber scissors. The cuts were irregular, rushed. Why would someone cut a dead child's hair? Or had he been alive when the cutting was done? Dr. Spellman found evidence of chronic malnutrition. The child's teeth showed signs of poor dental care. He had multiple scars on his body. Some old, some more recent. A particularly notable scar on his chin suggested a significant injury at some point in his short life. More disturbing still, there was evidence that the child might have been suffering from some type of untreated medical condition. His body showed signs of possible long-term neglect. The stomach contents were analyzed. The child had eaten approximately 2 to 3 hours before his death. The food was simple, something like a soup or stew. Nothing unusual, nothing that could provide clues about where he had been. Investigators photographed the body extensively, taking special care with any distinctive marks that might help with identification. They took fingerprints. They measured every dimension of his body. They documented every scar, every bruise, every detail that might eventually lead to his identity. But even with all this information, they remained with the same haunting questions. Who was this child? Where did he come from? And why was no one looking for him? That last question would be the one that most haunted investigators. In 1957, a 4 to 6-year-old child didn't simply disappear without someone noticing. Someone should have missed him. Someone should have reported his disappearance. Someone should have come to claim him. But no one did. The Philadelphia police made an unprecedented decision. They would publish the post-mortem photographs of the child, hoping that someone, anyone, would recognize him. It was a desperate measure, but they were dealing with a desperate case. The photographs were taken carefully. The child's eyes were opened. His head was positioned to look as natural as possible. The images were disturbing, clearly photographs of a dead child, but investigators hoped that someone could see past the death and recognize a son, a brother, a neighbor. The photographs were distributed to every police department in the Philadelphia area. They were sent to police stations across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. They were published in newspapers. They were hung in post offices, grocery stores, laundromats, anywhere people might see them. Detectives visited every school in the Philadelphia area. They showed the photographs to teachers, principals, cafeteria staff. Did anyone recognize this child? Had any student suddenly stopped attending without explanation? They visited orphanages, group homes, adoption agencies. They reviewed birth records, death records, missing persons reports. They contacted hospitals, asking about any child who had been treated for head injuries in the weeks before the body's discovery. The response was overwhelming but also disheartening. Thousands of leads came in. People called saying they recognized the child, that he was their neighbor, their cousin, someone's son they knew. Every lead had to be followed. Every potential identification had to be verified. But one by one, the leads evaporated. The child they thought it was turned out to be alive and well. The person they believed was the father had a solid alibi. The missing child they thought matched turned out to have a different age, different hair color, completely different features. Detectives worked tirelessly, following every lead, no matter how improbable. They interviewed thousands of people. They traveled up and down the East Coast chasing reports of missing children. Each time, they came back empty-handed. The case was becoming famous, or rather infamous. Newspapers began referring to the child as the boy in the box and America's unknown child. Articles ran across the country, spreading his story beyond Philadelphia. But the fame didn't bring answers. Only more questions, more theories, more dead ends. As weeks passed without identification, investigators began developing theories about who this child might be and how he had ended up in that woods. Theory 1. The child was from an abusive home. His parents or caregivers had killed him, intentionally or accidentally, and had disposed of the body, hoping it would never be found. The fact that no one reported him missing supported this. Perhaps the child had never been officially registered. Perhaps he had been kept hidden from authorities, abused or neglected until he finally died. Theory 2. The child was from outside the Philadelphia area. Someone had brought him there specifically to dispose of the body, knowing it would be harder to trace back to his home city or state. The Fox Chase Woods were remote but accessible, the perfect place to leave a body if you wanted it to be found eventually but not immediately. Theory 3. The child was from a family that didn't want contact with police. Perhaps they were undocumented immigrants who feared deportation. Perhaps they had their own reasons for avoiding law enforcement scrutiny. This theory would explain why no one came forward to claim him. Theory 4. The child had been sold or given away, part of some black market adoption market that existed in the shadows of respectable society. When he died, his adopters simply disposed of the body like they would unwanted trash. Each theory had merit. Each explained different aspects of the case. But none could be proven without the critical missing piece of information: the child's identity. Detectives pursued every angle. They investigated black market adoption rings known to operate in the Philadelphia area. They interviewed social workers, nurses, doctors, anyone who might have knowledge of children placed in questionable homes. They reviewed birth records looking for any child born around 1951 to 1953, the child's estimated age range, who had no corresponding later records, no school enrollments, no medical records, no paper trail confirming their continued existence. It was monumental work, and it yielded exactly 0 concrete results. The boy in the box remained nameless. On July 24, 1957, almost 5 months after his body was found, the boy in the box was finally buried. The Philadelphia police had kept the body as long as they could, hoping against hope that someone would come to claim him. No one did. Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia's Cedarbrook neighborhood donated a plot. A local casket manufacturer donated a small coffin. A monument company donated a headstone that simply read, "America's Unknown Child." But this would not be a lonely burial. The people of Philadelphia, moved by the tragedy of an unnamed and unclaimed child, showed up by the hundreds. The funeral became a community event, a way for the city to say goodbye to a child no one had known but everyone mourned. More than 400 people attended the service. They stood shoulder to shoulder around the small grave, many openly weeping. They had brought flowers, hundreds of bouquets that covered the ground around the coffin. Some had brought toys, teddy bears, toy cars, dolls, gifts for a child who could no longer receive them. Reverend Gregory Logue of St. Peter's Episcopal Church conducted the service. "We don't know his name," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "We don't know where he came from, but we know he was one of God's children. We know he deserves to be mourned. And we know that someone, somewhere, committed a terrible wrong against this innocent child." The detectives who had worked the case were there, their faces grim. Some had spent countless hours trying to give this child a name. They had seen the autopsy photographs 1,000 times. They had chased hundreds of leads to dead ends. And now they were laying the child to rest without having accomplished their most basic goal. As the small coffin was lowered into the earth, many of the attendees threw flowers into the grave. Some threw letters, notes written to a child who could never read them, telling him he was loved, he was remembered, he mattered. The funeral was covered extensively by the media. Photographs of the service appeared in newspapers across the country. The story of the nameless child that hundreds of strangers had come to mourn touched hearts around the world. But even with all that attention, even with all that media coverage, no one came forward with information about his identity. The boy in the box was buried as he had lived, nameless, unknown, unclaimed. As months turned into years, the boy in the box case didn't close, but it did go cold. The detectives who originally worked it retired or moved on to other cases. New investigators took their place, each bringing fresh eyes and new ideas, but none finding the breakthrough that was needed. The grave at Ivy Hill became a pilgrimage site of sorts. People came to leave flowers, especially on the anniversary of when the body was found. At Christmas, gifts appeared, toys carefully wrapped for a child who would never grow older. In 1998, more than 40 years after the murder, Psychic Remington decided to get involved in the case. She claimed to have information about the child's identity and the circumstances of his death. Her story was elaborate and specific, involving a family who had purchased the child, abuse in a home, and an accident that had led to his death. The Philadelphia police, desperate for any lead after decades without progress, investigated Remington's claims exhaustively. But despite the specificity of her story, they couldn't find evidence to corroborate it. The house she described didn't exist. The people she named couldn't be located or turned out to have no connection to the case. Remington's claims generated new media attention on the case, but ultimately led nowhere. They remained just another dead end in an investigation full of them. In 1998, the child's body was exhumed. Advances in DNA technology offered new possibilities for identification. Tissue samples were taken and a DNA profile was created. This profile was entered into national databases, compared against samples from relatives of missing children, checked against every promising lead that arose. But DNA, as powerful as it was, couldn't identify someone if there was nothing to compare it to. The boy in the box's profile remained in the databases, waiting for a match that never came. In 2016, the boy in the box case found new life thanks to a dedicated researcher named Nora. She wasn't a detective or law enforcement professional. She was an amateur genealogist with a passion for solving mysteries from the past. Nora had been fascinated by the boy in the box case since she was a child growing up in Philadelphia. As she grew older and developed expertise in genealogy, she began to wonder if the new tools available, online genealogy databases, DNA testing sites, digitized records, might finally give the child a name. She began working on the case unofficially, dedicating her free time to research. She contacted the Philadelphia police, offering her help. Initially skeptical, they eventually agreed to work with her, particularly after cases like the Golden State Killer were solved using genetic genealogy techniques. Nora's approach was methodical. She started with what they knew. The child was between 4 and 6 years old in 1957, meaning he was born between 1951 and 1953. There should be a birth certificate somewhere. There should be hospital records. Someone should remember him. She combed through thousands of birth certificates from the Philadelphia area, looking for male children born during that time period who had no subsequent records, no school enrollments, no medical records, no death certificates. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but Nora was patient and thorough. She also investigated family histories in the Fox Chase area, speaking with longtime residents, reviewing old newspapers, looking for any mention of a young child who might fit the profile. She interviewed anyone who was still alive who might have lived in the area in 1957. One of her most significant discoveries was tracking down the original witness, the college student who had found the body first but didn't report it. Now an elderly man, he finally spoke about what he had seen that day, providing details that had never before been part of the official record. But despite her best efforts, despite years of dedicated research, Nora couldn't give the boy in the box a name. Every promising lead led to another dead end. Every potential identification turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. The child remained a mystery. One of the most intriguing leads in the boy in the box case involved a house near where the body was found. It was just a few blocks away, a modest residence in the Fox Chase neighborhood that had been the focus of suspicion for decades. In 1957, the house was inhabited by a family that neighbors remembered as strange and secretive. They had several children, but neighbors rarely saw them playing outside. The children appeared neglected, poorly dressed, nervous around adults. One investigator noticed that the house's basement had a door with scratches that appeared to have been made by small hands. Inside the basement, the paint showed signs of having been recently applied over older stains. Had someone been trying to cover evidence? The JCPenney box that contained the body was the type used for bassinet cribs. The family in this house had recently purchased such a bassinet from JCPenney. When detectives asked them about the box, they said they had thrown it away. But had they really thrown it away, or had they used it for another purpose? Detectives interviewed the family multiple times. The parents were defensive, uncooperative. They couldn't provide clear alibis for the time period when the body must have been left in the woods. When asked about their children, how many they had, what their ages were, their answers were vague and contradictory. One of the family's children, now an adult, later told investigators they remembered a young child being kept in the house's basement. The child was thin, frightened, often covered in bruises. One day, the child simply wasn't there anymore. When the witness asked about him, they were told to stay quiet, to never speak of that child to anyone. But without physical evidence linking the family to the body, without proof that the child they remembered was the boy in the box, authorities couldn't make arrests. The testimony of an adult witness about vague childhood memories from 60 years ago wasn't enough for prosecution. The house itself was eventually demolished. Whatever evidence it might have contained was lost forever. Over the years, several people have been named as possible suspects in the murder of the boy in the box. None were formally charged, but each remained under a cloud of suspicion. There was a woman who lived near the disposal site who had been treated for mental illness. Neighbors remembered her acting strangely around the time the body was found. She claimed to have seen a man carrying something that looked like a doll wrapped in a blanket in the area just before the discovery. Had she actually been a witness, or had she been involved somehow? There was a man who had worked for JCPenney who would have had easy access to bassinet boxes. He had a history of violent behavior and had been investigated for child abuse charges. He lived within a 5-mile radius of the disposal site, but he died before investigators could fully interrogate him. There were stories about a prominent businessman who allegedly was involved in a black market adoption ring. Rumors suggested he bought children from desperate mothers and sold them to couples who couldn't adopt through legal channels. Had the boy in the box been one of these children, a child who died while in the care of illegal adopters who then disposed of his body? And always it came back to the family in the corner house. The house with the strange basement, the neglected children, the JCPenney box they had thrown away. Did they know more than they were admitting? Or were they simply the target of unfounded suspicion because they lived near the disposal site? Each suspect was investigated exhaustively. Alibis were checked, backgrounds were reviewed, stories were confirmed. And each time, the crucial piece of evidence was missing that would turn suspicion into proof. The boy in the box remained unavenged. In 2019, there was finally a ray of hope. Advances in genetic genealogy technology. The same kind of techniques used to identify the Golden State Killer offered a new path toward identification. The Philadelphia police partnered with DNA laboratories specializing in cold case work. The boy in the box's DNA profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases, where it could be compared against millions of profiles of people who had taken consumer DNA tests. The process was complex. Although the child himself hadn't taken a DNA test, genetic genealogists could search for relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, any family connection that might lead them back to a specific family branch. Once they identified potential relatives, they would build massive family trees, working backward through generations to find common ancestors. Then they would work forward through each branch of the tree, identifying all the descendants of those common ancestors, until they could narrow down to individuals who matched the boy in the box's profile, male children born between 1951 to 1953 in or around the Philadelphia area. It was tedious, time-consuming, and required incredible expertise in both genealogy and genetics. But it had worked in other cases. Could it work here? The genealogists began building what would eventually become a massive family tree with thousands of individuals. They traced family lines through Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and beyond. They reviewed birth certificates, death certificates, census records, obituaries, anything that might help them track family connections. And then, in December 2022, 65 years after the body was found, they made an announcement that shocked everyone who had followed the case. They had identified the boy in the box. On December 8, 2022, Philadelphia Police Detective Captain Jason Smith stood before cameras and made the announcement the city had been waiting for more than 6 decades. "Today," he said, his voice firm but weighted with emotion, "we can finally give the boy in the box a name." His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He was 4 years old when he died. And although it's taken 65 years, we finally know who he was. The room erupted in questions. How had they identified him? Who had killed him? What had happened to him? Captain Smith explained that genetic genealogists working with the child's DNA profile had traced distant relatives. From there, they built massive family trees until they could identify a specific family branch. Within that family branch, there was only one male child of the right age who had no confirmable subsequent records. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was born on January 13, 1953. His parents were identified as Augustus Zarelli and Mary Elizabeth Zarelli, maiden name Plunkett. The family had lived in Philadelphia, moving between several addresses in the western part of the city. But while investigators now knew who Joseph was, the bigger questions remained unanswered. Who had killed him, and why had no one reported him missing? Records showed that Joseph's mother, Mary Elizabeth, had died in 1973. His father, Augustus, died in 1976. Both were long gone before anyone even knew to ask the right questions about what had happened to their son. Joseph had had siblings, children who were now elderly adults. Investigators began the delicate process of tracking them down and contacting them. Did they remember their brother? Did they know what had happened to him? The interviews painted a disturbing picture. The Zarelli family had been deeply dysfunctional. There was abuse, neglect, poverty. Children were often moved between relatives, left with babysitters, sometimes simply abandoned. In the chaos of that unstable family life, a small child could disappear without anyone asking official questions. One of the siblings vaguely remembered Joseph, a small, quiet child who always seemed afraid. And then, one day, he simply wasn't there anymore. When they asked about him, they were told not to ask questions, to stay quiet. But who specifically had killed Joseph? Investigators believed the answer lay within the family. but with the parents both dead for decades, it would be nearly impossible to prove who had struck Joseph in the head, bathed him, cut his hair, and left him in that woods wrapped in a blanket. After Joseph's identification was made public, the Philadelphia community came together once again to honor his memory, but this time with his real name. A new headstone was commissioned for his grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery. Where it had once only said, "America's Unknown Child," it now read, "Joseph Augustus Zarelli, January 13th, 1953, February 1957, beloved by thousands." A memorial ceremony was held at his grave site. Hundreds of people attended, some who had been at his original funeral 65 years before, now elderly but still remembering. Others who had followed his case through the years, and some who simply wanted to pay their respects to a child who had suffered so much. The detectives who had worked the case, both the originals who were still living and those who had taken the case in later years, were there. For many of them, this represented closure on a case that had defined their careers. "We spent 65 years wondering who he was," said one retired detective, tears running down his aged face. "And now we finally know. It's Joseph. His name is Joseph." People left flowers, thousands of them. They left toys, as they had done at his original funeral. But now they also left notes addressed to him by name. "Rest in peace, Joseph. You are loved, Joseph. You will never be forgotten, Joseph." The act of naming him, of saying Joseph instead of the boy in the box, felt like restoring his humanity, giving back some of the dignity that had been stolen from him in life and in death. But even as they celebrated finally knowing his name, the community grappled with the questions that remained. Who had killed him? Would anyone ever be held accountable? Or would the mystery remain partially unsolved forever? Although Joseph Zarelli now had a name, the case wasn't closed. The Philadelphia police made it clear this was still an active homicide investigation. Although Joseph's parents were dead, other people who might have been involved in his death or in disposing of his body could still be alive. Investigators began the process of tracking down anyone who had been in contact with the Zarelli family around 1957. Old neighbors, distant relatives, family friends, anyone who might shed light on what had happened to Joseph. They also reviewed the case with fresh eyes, now knowing Joseph's identity. Addresses where the Zarelli family had lived were checked against the disposal site. How far was it? Was it a logical place for someone from those addresses to dispose of a body? School records were reviewed. Had any of Joseph's siblings attended schools in the Fox Chase area? Did anyone in the family have connections to that neighborhood? Detectives searched for any legal records that might shed light on the family situation. Had the Zarelli children ever been in foster care? Had reports been filed with Child Protective Services? Had authorities been involved with this family in any way? What they discovered was a system that had failed Joseph completely. In the 1950s, child protection wasn't what it is today. Children fell through the cracks all the time. Families moved from place to place, evading scrutiny. Children who were never officially registered, never enrolled in school, could essentially disappear without anyone asking questions. Joseph had been one of those children. Born into a chaotic and abusive family, moved from place to place, possibly never enrolled in school, possibly never seen by a doctor unless his injuries were so severe they required a hospital. He was invisible to the system until he was found dead in a woods. With the new information about Joseph's identity, investigators revisited old theories about his death. Some gained new credibility. Others were dismissed entirely. The theory that Joseph had been sold or given away as part of a black market adoption seemed less likely now. Records showed he was a legitimate child of Augustus and Mary Elizabeth Zarelli, but that didn't rule out the possibility that he had been given to another family at some point, formally registered to his biological parents, but living elsewhere with unrelated caregivers. The theory that he had died in an abusive home gained strength. The Zarelli family certainly fit the profile. But had he died while in the care of his biological parents, or had he been placed with another family where the abuse occurred? A new theory emerged based on the family's records. Mary Elizabeth Zarelli, Joseph's mother, had struggled with mental health issues. In an era before modern mental health treatment, such struggles often led to family crises. Could her illness have played a role in Joseph's death? Augustus Zarelli, the father, had a history of violence and alcohol abuse. Neighbors from that period remembered him as temperamental, unpredictable, sometimes violent. Had he struck Joseph in a fit of rage? Had Mary Elizabeth then washed the body, cut his hair, and helped dispose of it, protecting her husband from consequences? Or perhaps Joseph had been placed with relatives, maybe an aunt, uncle, or grandparents, and had died while under their care. The family's silence about what happened to Joseph could have been a pact between all of them, everyone agreeing never to speak of him, never to acknowledge his existence, to keep the secret until their own deaths. Each theory had some evidence to support it. None could be conclusively proven. Joseph's surviving siblings, now in their 70s and 80s, were contacted by investigators. Their interviews provided glimpses of what Joseph's life might have been like, but created as many questions as they answered. One of the siblings remembered that Joseph was a quiet child, almost invisible within the chaotic family. He was small for his age, often sick, frequently covered in bruises that no one explained. The other children learned not to ask questions about Joseph, to act as if he wasn't there. Then, sometime in early 1957, Joseph simply disappeared. When the children asked about him, they were told firmly never to mention his name again. They were told that Joseph had gone away, and it was best to forget he had ever existed. The children, frightened of their parents, obeyed. They never spoke of Joseph to teachers, neighbors, or any authority. It was as if he had been erased from family memory. Years later, when the siblings saw news coverage about the boy in the box, some wondered if it could be Joseph. But the child in the photographs had been described as well-nourished, well cared for before his death. Joseph had been thin, neglected. The photographs didn't look like him, or at least didn't look like how they remembered him. And beyond that, they had been trained from childhood never to speak of Joseph. The silence had been so deeply ingrained in them that even as adults, even when they might have helped solve the mystery, they remained quiet. Only now, in their declining years, with their parents long dead, did they finally feel able to speak. But their memories were faded, incomplete, colored by decades of trying to forget. They couldn't say with certainty what had happened to Joseph, only that one day he was there and the next he wasn't. The harsh reality is that someone is unlikely to ever be officially held accountable for Joseph Zarelli's death. Both parents have been dead for nearly 50 years. Anyone else who might have been directly involved is probably also dead or so elderly that prosecution would be impossible. The case remains technically open. The Philadelphia police have said they will continue investigating, following any leads that arise. But without a living suspect, without physical evidence that can be tested in court, without witnesses willing or able to testify about what they saw, the chances of a legal resolution are essentially zero. This is hard to accept for those who have followed the case. After 65 years of waiting, after all the work put into identifying Joseph, it feels profoundly unfair that his killer will never face consequences. But perhaps there are other types of justice beyond the legal. Joseph finally has a name. His story is finally told. He's no longer an unknown child with no one to claim him. He's Joseph Augustus Zarelli, remembered, mourned, loved by thousands of people who never knew him in life. His grave is no longer a monument to anonymous tragedy. It's a headstone for a real child with a real name, a child whose short life continue 8:35 p.m., though filled with suffering, is finally acknowledged and honored. Children who are abused and murdered often disappear without a trace. Never reported missing, never searched for, their lives and deaths ignored by a world that didn't know them. Joseph could have been one of them. Instead, his story became a cause that mobilized an entire city, that inspired decades of dedicated investigation, that finally led to him being named and remembered. If there's justice in that, in being known, in being remembered, in matching, then perhaps Joseph has finally found it. Joseph Zarelli's case teaches us unsettling truths about child protection, social inequality, and the children who fall through the cracks of the system. In the 1950s, when Joseph was alive, there was little in the way of social safety nets. Families like the Zarellis, poor, unstable, struggling with mental illness and addiction, were often on their own. Children in such families suffered without anyone knowing or intervening. Today, we have better systems in place, mandated reporters, child protective services, better protection laws. But children still fall through the cracks. Children still suffer and die in circumstances that could have been prevented if someone had paid attention, if someone had intervened. Joseph's case also highlights how children from poor and marginalized families are more vulnerable. Children from stable middle-class families don't disappear without massive searches being launched. But children like Joseph, from chaotic families that move frequently, that evade official scrutiny, can disappear without anyone outside the immediate family noticing. It also shows us the power of determination and technology. For 65 years, Joseph's case seemed impossible to solve. But dedicated genealogists using modern DNA methods finally gave him a name. It suggests that no matter how cold a case, there's always hope that advances in technology can bring answers. Finally, the case reminds us that every victim deserves to be named, remembered, and honored. Joseph wasn't just a case, an unknown child, a mystery. He was a real person who lived and suffered and died. Giving him his name back, telling his story, that matters, that honors his memory in ways that go beyond legal justice. As this story comes to its end, I ask you to take a moment to think about Joseph Augustus Zarelli, not as the boy in the box, that title that defined him for so long, but as Joseph, a small 4-year-old child who deserved love, care, safety, and instead knew only suffering. Think about what his life might have been if he had been born into different circumstances. What kind of man might he have become? What dreams might he have pursued? What family might he have raised? All those possibilities were stolen from him before his life really began. Think about the investigators who spent 65 years searching for his name. The detectives who worked the original case, many of whom died never knowing they had been trying to identify Joseph Zarelli. The new investigators who took the case, determined to finish what their predecessors had started. The genealogists who spent countless hours building family trees, chasing leads, refusing to give up. Think about the people of Philadelphia who attended his funeral in 1957, mourning a child they didn't know. The people who left flowers at his grave every year on the anniversary of when he was found. The strangers who wrote letters to the police, offering theories, leads, desperate to help give him a name. Joseph's story is tragic. There's no way to sugarcoat it. A small child suffered and died, and those responsible never faced appropriate justice. But his story is also about something else, about communities that come together to care for their most vulnerable, about investigators who never give up, about the fundamental belief that every life matters, that every person deserves to be known and remembered. As you drift off to sleep tonight, with the sound of rain falling softly outside, think about Joseph. Say his name quietly, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Remember that he was real, that he mattered, that though his life was short and painful, he is finally known. The bassinet box that was his coffin is long gone. The woods where he was found have changed, developed, transformed by decades of urban growth. But his grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery remains, now marked with his true name. And at that grave, there are still fresh flowers. There are still people who come to pay their respects. Because Joseph, though abandoned in life, has never been forgotten in death. Rest in peace, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Your name was stolen from you in life, kept from you in death for 65 years, but now it's finally yours again. You are known, you are remembered, you are loved, and that, perhaps, is the most important kind of justice of all. Good evening and welcome once again to this quiet space where real stories from the past find their moment to be told with calm. Tonight, we're going to talk about a case that shocked Spanish high society in August 1980, the murder of the Marquesas of Urquio, a crime that revealed dark secrets behind elegant doors. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to share in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. Write your city, your country, what time it is for you. It's beautiful to know that in different places around the world, someone else is seeking these stories to rest. If you enjoy this content, narrated softly to help you relax, consider subscribing to the channel. Turn on notifications. And if you know someone else who seeks quiet stories, share this video. A like helps us greatly to reach more people who need this space of calm. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you to Madrid in 1980, to a mansion in the Salamanca district, where wealth and mystery met in a fatal way. The mansion on Lucana Street in Madrid's Salamanca district was imposing. Built at the beginning of the 20th century with a stone facade, tall windows, carved wooden doors. It was the type of building where Madrid's aristocracy lived. On the first floor lived the Marquesas of Urquijo. Javier de Urquijo, 74 years old, and his wife Maria de la Esperanza, 73. An elderly couple from one of Spain's most important families. The Urquijo surname had history, power, money. They were bankers, aristocrats with connections in the highest circles of Spanish society. Javier was a serious man, educated, of the old school. He had dedicated his life to the family business, to maintaining the surname with dignity. Maria de la Esperanza was an elegant lady, discreet, who moved in the appropriate social circles. They lived quietly in their mansion, surrounded by art, antique furniture, a lifetime of privilege. They had employees who took care of the house. They received visits from family and friends of their same social level. But there was something else in that mansion, something very few knew. The Marquesas had a nephew, Rafael Escobedo, who had lived with them for years. Rafael was 28 years old. He was the son of Javier's sister who had died when Rafael was young. The Marquesas had taken him in as if he were their son. They had given him everything: education, home, money. But Rafael was not like his aunt and uncle. He was not serious, not hardworking. He was a young man who enjoyed the easy life, who spent money, who went out at night, who frequented places that his aunt and uncle would not approve of. The Marquesas were worried about Rafael. They had talked with him several times about his behavior, about his future. But Rafael did not listen. And in the summer of 1980, that tension was about to explode. August 1st, 1980 was a hot Friday. Madrid in August was always hot. Many families had left on vacation to the coast, to the mountains. But the Marquesas had stayed in Madrid. That afternoon, Javier and Maria de la Esperanza had been at home resting. The employees had already left. Only they and Rafael remained in the mansion. Around 9 in the evening, the Marquesas had dinner, light as always. Then they retired to their bedroom. It was their routine. They went to bed early. Rafael was in his room on the upper floor. But that night, Rafael was not alone. There was someone else in the mansion. Someone who had entered without anyone seeing. What we do know is what happened next. Around 11 at night, someone entered the Marquesas' bedroom. Javier and Maria de la Esperanza were sleeping, or perhaps reading before sleep. They were attacked brutally with a blunt object, probably a heavy candlestick or a fireplace poker. Both died there in their own bed. There was no struggle. There were no screams. They were surprised. Perhaps they didn't even fully wake before dying. It was quick, it was brutal, it was final. And after the crime, the killer or killers left. They closed the door, left the mansion in silence. And the night continued as if nothing had happened. The morning of Saturday, August 2nd, dawned sunny. The employees arrived at their usual time, around 9, to begin the day's tasks. They rang the bell. No one answered. That was strange. The Marquesas were always awake at that hour. They used their key. They entered the house. Everything seemed normal, orderly, quiet. They called out, "Don Javier, Dona Esperanza." There was no response. They went up the stairs. They approached the bedroom. The door was closed. They knocked. Nothing. One of the employees opened the door, and what he saw left him paralyzed. The Marquesas were in bed, motionless. There was blood on the sheets, on the walls. It was a terrible scene. The employee ran out. He shouted to the others, Call the police. The masters are dead. The police arrived within minutes. The Salamanca district was an important area. These things didn't happen there, not to families like the Urquios. The investigators examined the scene. 2 elderly people murdered in their bed, with blows to the head. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no signs of robbery. The jewels were there, the money was there. Nothing of material value was missing. This was not a robbery. It was something personal, something close. The investigators began to ask, who had access to the house? Who knew the Marquis's routine? Who would benefit from their deaths? And all the answers pointed in the same direction. Rafael Escobedo, the nephew. The police looked for Rafael immediately, but he was not at the mansion. He was nowhere they could find. They interrogated the employees. They all said the same thing. Rafael lived there. He had keys. He knew the house. There had been tension lately between him and his aunt and uncle. The Marquises, according to the employees, had talked about changing their will. They were worried about Rafael's behavior, about how he spent money, about his friendships. Rafael was going to inherit a considerable fortune when his aunt and uncle died. But if they changed the will, that would change everything. The police began to build the theory. Rafael knew that his aunt and uncle were considering disinheriting him, and he decided to act before it was too late. But there was a problem. They couldn't find Rafael. He had disappeared completely. They put his photo in all the newspapers, in all the police stations. They alerted airports, train stations, ports. But Rafael seemed to have vanished. Days passed. The media pressure was enormous. The Urquios were an important family. This was national news. Everyone wanted to know who had killed the Marquises. And then, a week later, a call came to the police. A man who wouldn't give his name said he knew where Rafael was. The police followed the lead, and they found Rafael hidden in an apartment on the outskirts of Madrid, living with a friend who had helped him hide. They arrested him without resistance. Rafael knew he couldn't escape forever. At the police station, under interrogation, Rafael finally confessed. He said yes, that he had killed his aunt and uncle, but that he had not been alone, that he had had help. He mentioned an accomplice, but the details were always confusing. Some reports said it was a close friend, others that it was someone Rafael had hired. It was never completely clear. What was clear was that Rafael Escobedo, the nephew, the heir, had murdered the 2 people who had given him everything. Rafael Escobedo's trial began in 1981. It was a media trial. The newspapers covered every detail. Madrid's high society was shocked. How was it possible that a nephew would murder his own aunt and uncle? How could someone kill for money the people who had raised him? Rafael's defense tried to argue that he had had mental problems, that he had been under pressure, that he had not acted rationally. But the prosecution presented clear evidence. Rafael had planned the crime. He had waited for the moment when the employees were not there. He had acted with premeditation. And most damning, Rafael had confessed with details that only the killer could know. The jury found him guilty. Rafael Escobedo was sentenced to 30 years in prison for double murder. He served his sentence in various Spanish prisons. He was released on parole years later when he was already an older man. He tried to disappear from public life. He changed his identity, moved far from Madrid. The mansion on Lucana Street was sold by the family. No one wanted to live there after what had happened. The building changed owners several times. Today, it is a residential building divided into apartments. The Urquio family never fully recovered from the tragedy. Not only had they lost 2 beloved members, they had also discovered that someone of their own blood was capable of something so terrible. The crime of the Marquises of Urquio reminds us that wealth does not protect from tragedy, that privilege does not guarantee security, that sometimes danger comes from where we least expect it. Javier and Maria de la Esperanza had lived long lives, full lives. They had raised their nephew Rafael as if he were their son. They had given him love, home, future, and he, out of greed, out of impatience, for reasons that perhaps even he himself did not fully understand, took their lives. Two people in their 70s murdered in their own bed, in their own home by someone they trusted. It is a story that makes us reflect on human nature, on greed, on how money can corrupt even the strongest family ties. Tonight we have remembered Javier de Urquio and Maria de la Esperanza. Two long lives ended brutally by someone who should have protected them. If the story accompanied you tonight, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Share your city, your country, your local time. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories from the past. Give it a like if you enjoyed the content, and share it with someone seeking quiet stories for the night. Good night. May you rest in peace. May your dreams be peaceful. Sweet dreams. Until the next story.